Hi there, this is Jenny from the Sewing Palace in Helena, Montana. Today I'm coming to you from my sewing room to show you a fun project making a pillow out of a laser cut kit. The kit is called Quilter's Gonna Stash. The first thing that I'm going to show you is how to work with a laser cut kit. All the shapes are pre-cut, but I'm going to show you how to lay them out onto your background fabric. Then I'm going to show you how to applique using your sewing machine and decorative threads. Then we're going to quilt it, so we're going to layer it with batting and backing, and we're going to quilt the background fabric using free motion stitching. And last, we're going to turn it into a pillow with a zipper. This project is available on our website as a kit. This is a complete kit with all of the fabrics that you'll need to get started for the pillow front. So here is the pattern, and this is what it will look like when you're starting to work on it. And I'm just going to show you what a complete kit looks like. So you have a layout diagram with all of the letters on it and a placement line on that diagram. The other thing that you have in the kit is directions on how to do the process. Then you have your background fabric, which is white, and then all of your letters that are all pre-cut ready to apply to your fabric. They already have fusible web attached to the back. They've been cut with a laser so the edges are very nice and crisp and they look beautiful. So you'll pull off the background or the fusible web and you'll apply it to the background. So I'm going to show you how to get that started. Let's get a couple supplies collected. We have our kit with our background fabric, a nice hot iron that you'll be using. Underneath here I have a fusible pressing sheet. This is called a Fusimat and is wonderful for this type of project. I have my layout diagram that was in my kit, and then I have a woolly pressing mat underneath. So you'll want to layer those up just like this. So you're going to have your ironing board or your pressing mat, your layout diagram, and then your Fusimat laying over top. See how nicely you can see through that Fusimat? Then you're going to lay your background fabric down. You'll want to keep your center line that is down the center this way and the center that way. The other little gadget that's helpful is a pin, so I have that set aside. And you can press out your creases from being folded in the kit around that center line, but you want to keep this center line. So you have all your supplies together, and what you want to first do is layer your template underneath your fusible mat, and it will lay over top so that it will protect it and you can still see through it. This center line I can still see very well, and those creases that I left in the fabric I will then line up on the center horizontal and vertical so that I have my center. I can still see through my fabric quite well. You may not be able to see it on camera, but I can see the letter S is right here. So then I will take my letters and I will place them over top so that I have my applique positioned following the diagram. Once you have them all positioned, you can finish with the top letters and the middle letters, and then you will take the pieces of fabric and you will pull off the fusible web paper. So there's paper on the backs of all of these, and you'll just gently pull that off so that the paper comes off. What stays in the background is still fusible web, and so that will then lay back down with the paper removed, and then you'll take your iron and iron it all down with a nice hot press over the whole project. Once you have ironed your applique to your background fabric, you're now ready to start stitching around the edges. You want to collect a couple of supplies. One of them is a fusible interfacing that I've applied to the back of my project. So I've actually fused to the back of my project this interfacing. This is called Pellon Shape Flex. It's a fusible woven interfacing. It just adds a little bit of strength to your fabric when you're appliquing. Then, when you're doing decorative stitches, in order for them to lay nice and flat, you want to put on a tearaway interfacing. The one that I'm using is called Ultra Clean and Tear. I'll lay this underneath my applique on the wrong side and I'll stitch around that, and I'll show you that here in a moment. The other things that you'll want is some decorative thread. This is OESD Isocord polyester thread. It's very strong and comes in wonderful colors. And then you'll want an applique pressing foot. So this one is called the number 20 open toe embroidery foot, and it works great for applique. So just in review, I have threaded up my sewing machine with a decorative thread through the eye of the needle. I've also put the same thread in my bobbin, so I have those two threads ready to go. I have fused onto the back of my project Shape Flex so that it is fused, and I've cut pieces of Ultra Clean and Tear to lay underneath. I have started sewing this project already, so today we're going to be appliquing around the letter R. So I'm going to get a piece of Ultra Clean and Tear. I'm just going to tear it so you can see how easily that tears away. That is going to get laid underneath my applique. Now if you were doing the whole thing, you would get a piece that's big enough for all of it, but right now we're doing the letter R. So I'm going to lay it underneath and smooth it out, and then I'm going to get ready to start stitching. Today I'm sewing on a Bernina 3 series. This machine has several decorative stitches, and I'm going to use the double blanket stitch. So you'll see around some of my applique that I've already done, it's a very bold stitch so you can see it very well. It does it 2 times. And then I'm going to show you how to start it and tie it off. So when I start my stitches, I always start with a small straight stitch because that's very challenging to rip out. So I'm going to align my presser foot, and I'm going to zoom in on my stitch area so that you can see it. One of the wonderful things I like about a Bernina is it has something called temporary altered memory. So if I adjust a stitch, and we're going to take this straight stitch, this is a normal straight stitch, the needle's generally right down the center, and I'm going to change the stitch length so that it's very short, and that will be very challenging to rip out. Then the next thing I'll do is I'll move it so that the needle is over to the right. So now it's going to do a straight stitch that I have altered, but it's going to be on the right hand side, and it's going to be very short. The other stitch that I'm going to use on this machine is stitch number 79. So I'm going to type in number 79, and that stitch is the double blanket stitch. I'm going to alter this stitch by swinging the needle far to the right, so that stitch will form from the right hand side of the foot, and then I'm going to make it a little bit shorter and a little bit longer. So I am temporarily adjusting these stitches. I can go back and forth between the stitches and it will remember what I'm doing. So I've altered the straight stitch number 1, and I've altered the decorative stitch number 79. We're going to start with our altered straight stitch number 1. I'm going to also engage needle down so that when the needle is in stops, the needle will be down into the fabric. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to lower my foot so that the edge of the foot is right along the edge of my applique. Let's get a closer look. I'm going to lower my foot so that it's right on the edge of the applique. The inside of my toe is right along this edge. Remember, I altered that stitch so that the needle would swing to the right and it would form an altered straight stitch. So I'm going to start by doing a couple of those stitches, and it won't go very far because I've altered that stitch to be very short. Then I'm going to switch to my altered decorative stitch, which is number 79. Then that stitch will also form from the edge, and it is a double blanket stitch. So I take my time and I'll form my stitch along the edge of the fabric, watching the edge of the foot with the edge of the fabric. This is a great visual guide to keep it straight. You'll also learn about this stitch because it does it 2 times, and you'll know when you'll need to pivot and turn when each sequence is finished. So I'm coming to the corner of my applique, and I'm going to pivot just so that the swing of the inside goes to the inside of the fabric. Then I'm going to pivot again. You can see why needle down is very helpful for this. And I'll keep sewing along the edge of my applique, watching the edge of my foot. If you ever need to travel, you can switch back to that straight stitch. So I'm going to do that so you can see this. I'm going to switch to the straight stitch, and let's say I want to travel just a little bit to one corner and then start to do my decorative stitch. So you can use that altered straight stitch to travel along an edge. Right now I've just traveled a little bit, and now it's going to go back to my decorative stitch. I'm on the curved part of the R, and I just want to show that you need to pivot very frequently when you're on a curve, and you always want to pivot so that it's on the outside edge. So once you do your inside swing of this decorative stitch, you'll then want to pivot so that that straight stitch goes along the curve in front of it. So you might find that on a curve, you will pivot much more frequently than on a straight. Coming around the letter R, this is where I've started, so I'm going to trim off my thread from where I started, and I'm going to start to approach where my stitch will intersect where I started. So I'll just take my time and work my way. Coming down this straight stretch that I have done that little row of small straight stitches. So at this point I'm overlapping those straight stitches. This is a great way to tie it off, and I'm going to sew until those stitches start to overlap, which they are. Then I can switch back to my altered straight stitch and sew a series of small straight stitches along that edge to tie it off. When I'm finished, I'll raise my needle, lift my foot, and then trim my threads, and I will be finished with the outside. Then I need to go around the inside of the letter R. I have now appliqued around all of my shapes. Some of the smaller letters I chose to do a smaller double blanket stitch, so the width of the stitch was made a little skinnier. And some of my large letters I made that a little wider so that it would cover more of it and stand out. Once you have your applique all finished, you'll flip it over and you'll tear away your Ultra Clean and Tear stabilizer. So you just gently pull along the edges, and if little remnants are left over, they'll be very soft and you can leave those in. They will soften over time and actually go away, but you can just tear away that little bit of stabilizer, and you can get tweezers if you feel it necessary to get all these little edges, but I usually don't fuss about it too much. And you can either leave it underneath here, or again, you can take that away. Once you've torn away the majority of your Ultra Clean and Tear, remember, don't worry about the small little pieces. They are very soft and won't bother your project. Then you'll want to press it. So I usually use a product called Flatter. This doesn't stiffen your fabric, but it gets it very, very smooth. And so I'll take it to my woolly pressing mat and I will press it all out so that I have a beautiful little project. When you're all finished with your applique, you're then going to square up your block to 18.5 inches. This will make an 18-inch finished pillow or mini quilt. To do that, you'll fold it in half to find your center. So you'll lay it in half, find your center, which is right above the large letters that spell stash. You'll line that on the 9.25 inch line on your mat. So that's your center line. Then you'll open it up and you'll trim on the 0 and the 18.5. That will trim from your center point. You'll then rotate your block and do it the opposite direction. Again, find your center, fold it, line that center fold along the 9.25, open it up and trim on the 0 and the 18.5. When you're all done, you'll have a beautiful block that measures 18.5 inches square. I'll start with a 20-inch square of backing fabric, and that backing will lay wrong side up. So the wrong side of the fabric is facing up, and it's about 20 inches. Then I'll get a piece of batting that's also around 20 inches or a tiny bit smaller. This one's about 19. I'll smooth out the batting. Then I'll lay my top to make sure that it fits onto my fabrics with a little bit of extra all the way around. When you quilt something like this, you want extra batting and backing, so if things shrink up, they won't shrink beyond your quilt. So I'm going to smooth that all out. The other thing that I like to do is baste using a spray adhesive. So when I do that, I smooth everything out. You're going to open this up, and then you will spray it with an acid-free spray called 505. You just need a little bit of spray so that the area is slightly tacky. So it will just be slightly tacky, and then you'll smooth your batting out onto that surface, and then I'll get the other side. Once you have your batting all smoothed, you'll do the same with the top. You now have a quilt sandwich, which is ready to quilt. I'm ready to start quilting my quilt, and the best way to get set up for quilting is to get a very nice clear flat space so that you can freely move your quilt around without it getting inhibited or stopped by something on the side or behind the machine. So if you can make your space nice and big, maybe put on your slide-on table, put it into a cabinet so you have a nice flat space. You can also get large extended tables that go onto the machine when you have it set on a table, and that will make it a lot easier when you get to quilting. The first thing I'm going to do is some straight lines using my walking foot. So I'm going to show you how to attach the walking foot. The Bernina walking foot is a foot that has different sole plates on it. This one I have an open sole plate so I can actually see all my stitch area. And then it has a fork that goes up and down, which will add movement to the top layer of the fabric. So that helps feed that top layer. That fork is going to go over the needle bar, which is what goes up and down when you're sewing. So you want the needle in the highest position, and then you'll place your thumb underneath the fork and slide it on so that it goes over the needle bar, and then shimmy the foot on from the right-hand side. Then you'll clamp it in place. It's really quite easy to put on, but the first step is making sure you have the fork on. Let's talk about the ideal place to start quilting. So the flatter this space is that you have, the easier it is to feed layers of fabric through. So if you have a cabinet and it can sit down flat, that's the ideal way to quilt. If you have a slide-on table and your machine is sitting up on top of a table, put the biggest slide-on table that you have. You can buy supplementary tables that are a big acrylic table to increase your sewing space, but get that area nice and flat and smooth. The other thing is clear off from behind the sewing machine and to the left of the needle so that you can have a space that is easy to move fabric through. On the bottom of this project, I have stitched sequential lines using the Bernina walking foot. I put in a white bobbin thread and a white top threads to match my background fabric. This is totally up to you on what you want to start with, but this is a great way to add some beautiful flair to your quilt. So all these lines are the same distance, and what I'm using as a guide is the edge of the foot. You can mark lines on your fabric with a fabric-friendly pen and sew on those lines as well. So I'm going to start over on the side. I've done quite a few lines, and the place I left off is right here. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to go up. I'm going to pivot on my sewn line that I have across the top of the project. It's going all the way across. I'm going to pivot and turn and then come down the new side. So I'm going to start at the bottom. So I'll pivot my fabric around. And when I start quilting, I'm going to line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of the foot. So let's get a little closer to that so you can see that. And when I start sewing, I'm also going to engage the needle down function in the machine. So when I start sewing and I have to stop to readjust, the needle will be sunk in the fabric. So I'm going to sew up until this point that I need to stop, and I'll get real close to that. The needle will stop in the down position. Then I'm going to do some more programming from my temporary altered memory. Remember, a Bernina can remember stitches that you've altered. So I have a basic straight stitch programmed, and I'm also going to select a different stitch that I can start and stop with. So the stitch that I'm going to use is actually a zigzag stitch. I'm going to alter this stitch. This is the width of the stitch. I'm going to take the width completely away, and I'm also going to take the length and make it very short. So this is basically a very short straight stitch. And when I use that stitch, it will temporarily remember this until I turn the machine off. So this is a great way to toggle between your tie-off stitch and then your regular stitch, which is a straight stitch. When you want to tie it off again, you just go back to that tie-off stitch and it will temporarily remember. So now I'm going to tie off. I'm tying off the stitch, and then I'll raise my needle, and I've basically sewn a knot. I'll lift my foot, and then I'm going to slide my fabric to the next point that I want to start sewing. I still have my tie-off stitch, and I've still lined up the edge of the foot with the stitching. And I'm going to do about 7 stitches of the tie-off stitch. I'll then switch to stitch number 1 and quilt a straight line until I want to tie off again. I'll go back to this tie-off stitch, do a couple of stitches, raise my needle, lift the foot, and move to the next position. So I'm just doing sequential lines with a tie-off stitch. I'm tying off, go back to a straight stitch, then I'm going to sew to the line that is along the top of my quilt. Then I can pivot my quilt and sew a couple of stitches. Now I've done enough stitching that I found out that 6 stitches at this stitch length is about the distance. My needle's sunk in the fabric. I'll lift my foot and pivot to the next position. So now I'm ready to go. I have thread that is right along this edge of where I didn't sew, but that gives me a visual guide. So I'm going to zoom in on that so you can kind of see that. And I'm going to start quilting again. I'm back to my tie-off stitch. Done a couple of stitches. Then I slide my foot to the next position. I'm still using the edge of my foot as the guide, and I'm going to tie off right here, go back to a straight stitch, and then start quilting. Tie off, raise my needle, move to the next position. Again, I'm using this thread as my guide since there isn't any stitching there. So that's basically how I'll do the quilting on these sequential lines so that you can get a nice, even quilted look with just using your walking foot. We've finished all of our stitching using our walking foot and straight lines. We're now going to move on to a technique called free motion quilting. I have a couple of the feet set aside that you can use for free motion quilting. These are different styles of feet that have different soles on the bottom. Many of them are clear so you can see through. Some also allow you to couch or add cording as you free motion quilt. This is foot number 43, number 29, number 72 is a specialty foot that you can use rulers to quilt with. That's having a nice little training wheel. And this is one of my favorites. It's foot number 44C, and it is dished and it floats very nicely. When you put a normal presser foot on to your sewing machine when you're quilting and you drop the foot, you cannot easily move the fabric. When you put a free motion quilting foot on, it has the spring in the top, and therefore it floats over the fabric when the foot is down, so you can freely move it. The other thing that you do not need when you're free motion quilting is the feed dogs. There are the gadgets underneath that feed the fabric. So on a Bernina, there's a button over to the side to drop the feed dogs, and they'll stay out of the stitching area. There's also dials on other brands of machines or buttons that you can drop the feed dogs. So once you've got your feed dogs dropped and your thread and your selected presser foot, you'll be ready to go. The first thing you want to know about free motion quilting is you want to relax. So you might want to turn on some soft music or put on a nice book or maybe get a little wine to get you started. That's the best way for me to start quilting. You're ready. You're relaxed, you have your thread, you have your free motion foot, and you're going to start quilting. I'm going to start free motion quilting in the center, and I'm going to create a small little design that's just a little meander. I'm going to zoom in to the stitch area so you can see it a little better. You'll want to engage needle down. Remember, you'll want to have just a plain straight stitch, but your feed dogs are not doing any activity underneath. So if you don't move the fabric, it won't move. You do one needle up, one needle down, and then you pull your bobbin thread up. And that just allows you to make sure that your threads are all tidied and clean. Then when you start sewing, if you don't move the fabric, it won't go anywhere. So you'll want to have grip, hold your fabric, or maybe get some gloves to get a better grip on the fabric. And then you can move in any direction to freely quilt a beautiful design. Well, we did it. We made a fun project using a laser cut kit called Quilter's Gonna Stash. You learned how to do machine applique using your sewing machine and altering stitches. You learned how to install your walking foot and do some straight line quilting. And then you learned how to do free motion quilting. You could finish this project off with some binding, or you could frame it and put it in your sewing room. We do have a binding video on our YouTube channel, so you should check that out. If you want to learn how to make it into a pillow, join me for part 2 of the video. I'm going to do a zipper, and I'm also going to show you how to put in piping. So this will turn into an 18-inch pillow. Join me there if you'd like, or finish it off with binding. Thanks for watching today. This is Jenny from the Sewing Palace in Helena, Montana. Bye-bye.